My name is Sally Klein, Collogne, and I was program manager for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute back when it was the Southern Oregon Learning and Retirement from 2005, and I retired at the end of 2013. In 2005, I had moved that year to Ashland from the Bay Area and was starting to look for work, and had gotten a part-time position at SOU as an adjunct professor. And then a friend of mine said that they were hiring for a part-time position at OLLI. So I interviewed and got the position. And at that point of OLLI's development, I was called, I think, either program coordinator or program manager. They had a woman by the name of Aletha Lundblad, who was filling that part-time role, 20 hours a week, and she was getting ready to leave that role. So they interviewed, and I got the job. I was obviously not able to attend classes because I was working full-time. But when I retired in November of 2013, then I started to volunteer, so I did some volunteer. For a while, I did the community lectures. I did that for maybe a little over a year and a half, and enjoyed it. But that's when I started attending classes, were in 2014. You know, in 2015, when I first started, there were 400 members. And most of our business planning was based on increasing that membership. And in the first few years, trying to increase membership and also trying to attract and retain the best instructors that we could, that was really the challenge. But once we kind of hit that tipping point, then everybody started looking at OLLI as from a business development standpoint. How do you take a small organization and transform it into a viable long-term commitment? And so that was, at that stage, at the beginning stage, that was really the challenge. You know, how do we get in the market? How do we make sure that the people in Ashland and Medford and Talent and Phoenix know what, in the beginning it was SOLIR, Southern Oregon Learning and Retirement, and probably about 3 years into the role, we affiliated ourselves with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and then the challenges became much different in that we were part of a nationwide organization as opposed to be a department of Southern Oregon University. And there's challenges when you make that kind of shift from an organization. You know, what can we do? Do we do long-term planning? What kind of strategic planning? How does the paid manager of that organization work with the council? So it was all of that, trying to develop the goals and the market in order to sustain ourselves, and what do we need to do? And a lot of what helped that was the National Resource Center with the Osher organization, so they were able to kind of help us in that. And probably one of the biggest challenges was to bring the automation into OLLI. You know, I knew a couple of years before I retired what we would need to do in order to do online registration, and I knew that was something that we needed to do before I left, because we had developed most of the systems from scratch. And so I might not have been able to understand the IT component of it, but I understood what it was going to have to look like at the end. So those kinds of challenges. The organization itself becomes more sophisticated as it develops into a new stage of development. Okay, and how the paid position works with the council. What their role is, what is the organization's mission, culture, and so that was certainly prominent in those years. And we also began to, at the cusp of this, we began to hear people coming into the organization that were new to the Ashland area or the Medford area. And they would come into the office and tell us that they were looking for places to retire, and they wondered why, what was it that this community could offer them? And then to find out later, maybe 6 or 8 months later, that they had moved to Ashland because of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. So it's those kinds of, developmental stages that you really look forward to. Or there was a couple at one point that came in that weren't sure whether they wanted to live in Ashland or not, and they were worried about what would happen. They didn't have any children. They were worried about what was going to happen to them once one of them passed away. And then a year later, a year and a half later, them coming back in the office and saying, now that we have developed a relationship with OLLI, we're not worried about that anymore. So you know that you really touch people's lives in an organization far beyond just what is offered to them from a educational standpoint. Because of some of the objectives that we set up pretty early on with OLLI, or with SOLIR back in then, it was important for me to develop personal relationships with as many people as I could. And that's where a lot of my strength is. So we built up that membership to a point that that type of management style isn't as conducive, because you've reached into maybe 1,200 people. You can't spend the majority of your time continuing to develop those interpersonal relations like you could when you're 400. So I think that emphasis on how do we develop relationships and how do we self-identify were really important. And that has changed, because you can't continue to do that when you've got nearly 1,800 people. You can't do it. Well, I think probably the most long-term accomplishment is to setting up the online registration system, because I don't think that OLLI could have survived and grown as fast as it did if you didn't have those systems in place. So that was certainly from a organizational development standpoint, that was certainly important, and I think that the way that we did it, working with SOU, was really important. And I also think that being able to bridge the gap between Southern Oregon Learning and Retirement, or SOLIR, and OLLI was important, where we were working with an organization that was committed to higher learning for retirees all over the country. So it takes a different skill set, and I think that being able to help that transition and support that was really important. I think that one of the obstacles was you take an organization that's pretty small, that hasn't necessarily had an overlay of business on it, and as it grows, it becomes more and more important to model those business skills, to be able to structure it and organize it in a way that it's going to be here for a long time in the future. Okay? And I think that was one of the challenges, was the mindset in the beginning of how you organize something like an OLLI or a SOLIR was much different than it needed to be toward the end of my tenure. And people have a certain perception about whether they want the organization to grow or to not grow, because it was very small in the beginning. People love that kind of intimacy, when you've got a small group. And the idea that it was going to grow into something much bigger than that was challenging at times, because you have a lot of people that were very verbal about no growth and about minimizing the bureaucracy. I think that you can put structure to an organization without necessarily touching, turning it into a bureaucratic organization. So I think that was part of it. And as we grew the paid staff, you know, when we started off, it was just one person at part-time, and then the one person became full-time, and then you add on a student assistant, and it keeps growing. And as that grew, the consciousness of how do you want your organization to be managed is critical. So being able to be the face of that and the voice of that as a reflection of what the council wants is really important. Because if it weren't handled in a professional, strong way, there was always the chance that you'd kind of backstep instead of moving forward. So I think that was it. You know, there were some people that became very difficult to deal with, and you just like you do with any organization, you know, you give them voice and then go from there. I think part of the success was in knowing when to retire. I think that when my tendency with organizations is to be as one-on-one and as, you know, as close as I can be with as many people. So I got to know as many people as I could, which for me at that time was an easy thing to do. My memory now probably wouldn't support that, but back then it did. And you know, I think that at a certain point, you realize that the way that you manage is not sustainable. Not when you know it's going to grow into a much bigger organization, and that it won't, you know, you're working with a council, but then you're also working with a lot of volunteers, and that's the way that's growth. That's what you want it to do, and you need to kind of recognize, okay, this is what I can do, and I've done that. And now it's somebody else's turn, because we build on each other's strengths, as opposed to it being one or two people. So, you know, just identifying that and saying, okay, it's time. You know, that's about the time that I started thinking about an online registration system. You know, was, okay, I know that at a certain point in the not too distant future, I'm going to need to leave. And when I do that, I need to make sure that that's in place. So it's just being honest about, you know, and understanding organizational development. Well, I think that the value of OLLI is, first of all, this is a community that is, and by community I don't mean necessarily just Ashland. I mean Ashland, Medford, all of that. This community is it's an in destination for retirees, okay? And being able to be part of that and to be an in destination in itself attracts people not only to SOU, but it attracts people to this community. So I think that that's really important. I also think that there are a lot of people in their senior years that have come to a place where they need different skills than they did when they were middle-aged or even maybe into their 60s. And the Osher organization provides value in those senior years so that you're contributing, and you're contributing to other people that are in that same age group, and even younger. And I think that that's a value of what OLLI provides for this community and throughout the United States, because it's a pretty big voting population, and I think that reflects that, you know.